And then so for Spengler, in the civilization period, ethics begins to take priority over metaphysics. Whereas for Kant, the critique of practical reason was really secondary to and depended on the grand metaphysical system that he builds in the critique of pure reason. Um, you can't say the same thing he says about Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is homologous with Epicurus. Epicurus is the first, one of the first materialist philosophers to come along in the Hellenistic civilization. And in Schopenhauer, he says that despite the metaphysics that's in there, really Schopenhauer's metaphysics is simply a carryover from the previous epoch in which it was indispensable to have a metaphysic in order to be thought worthy of building one of these Kant-like types of systems, Kant or Hegel. You had to have metaphysics, but he says it's for the sake of the first three books in the World as Will and Representation that the fourth book, the one on ethics, exists at all. For Schopenhauer, ethics is everything, and the metaphysics now is in service to and lays the foundation for what's important to him, which is the ethics, which is to say that for Schopenhauer, he's the first philosopher in whom life becomes a problem, and trying to figure out how to live it and endure it is now the whole raison d'etre for the philosophy. Life is already becoming problematic. And in the civilization phase, it's distinguished from the culture phase in that life itself is a problem. It's a problem to be solved. And as Spengler says, where in the culture we had soul and religion, in the civilization now we have intellect and irreligion, impiety, materialism. Schopenhauer's transformation of the Kantian idea now of the brain as the center through which the will, the metaphysical will that corresponded in Kant to thing in itself, that which is behind the phenomenal world as it appears to our senses, becomes for Schopenhauer, the will pours itself meaninglessly and pointlessly through the intellect, and the intellect for Schopenhauer is very much something that's concretely in the brain. The brain, as he says, is a parasite of the nervous system, and it pours the will through it and turns it into a world picture. But for Schopenhauer, all of this is secondary to the ethics. His ethics that he builds around the idea of compassion and suffering as the great insight and so forth. And then he says, and notice too that the mathematics have dropped out, Spengler says, and that as 19th century philosophy moves on, by the time you get to Nietzsche, there is no real metaphysic anymore, just the idea of the will to power, and the whole thing in Nietzsche is a shift, his shift from Schopenhauer as his influence in the Wagner period, when he was a disciple of both Wagner and Schopenhauer, up until he wrote The Daybreak, I believe, or Human All Too Human, rather, is the first of his books to begin to demarcate the point at which he leaves Schopenhauer and Wagner behind. Spengler says this is the point where he shifted unconsciously to Darwinism and social Darwinism, which then became his main thing, and basically what he was a socialist, not politically speaking, but in terms of his instincts. The greatest good of the greatest number, how those who survive do so in terms of changing truths so that they are useful for the living of life, and the truth in service to life becoming now the primary criterion of whether a truth is useful or not. So then by the time we get to Nietzsche, we have, and this of course is all occurring at the same time that Marx is writing Das Kapital. Marx and Engels are creating Marxism, their version of the socialism that had already been inaugurated by Proudhon in the 1840s, and then Wagner had started out before reading Schopenhauer as a socialist, and his early drafts of the Great Ring Opera, The Death of Siegfried, that he wrote in around 1848, are themselves a socialist allegory in which the gold becomes the capitalist hoard, and Siegfried is thought of as a social revolutionary. And then after his encounter with Schopenhauer, of course, Wagner changed all that, but the semiotics, the socialist semiotics, do carry over into the finished product, so that you can see that in the Ring as it stands now, there's a mixed semiotic of right and left, of conservative and liberal, since Wagner changed over time his allegiance from the left to the right after his encounter with Schopenhauer. And then in the plays, he says the great philosophers are also great dramatists in this period. This is the period of Hebel, who inaugurates the first socialist drama in the middle of the century with Maria Magdalena. And then we have Strindberg, Ibsen, and Shaw, and George Bernard Shaw with his Man and Superman and Major Barbara are the great finishers up of this period of ethics, with its study of the Superman as an ideal, and Darwinism is the new thing, the materialism of the British. All this is preoccupied with ethics. Metaphysics has fallen out here. It's of no longer of any interest to the culture as a whole, and it's finished up, he says, in the plays of Shaw, at which point, beginning with, I suppose, his own philosophy, the culture shifts into its skeptical period. And skepticism then, which treats knowledge as a formal problem. In the metaphysical period, knowledge was a problem in and of itself, how it created and constructed the world. And then in the ethical period, knowledge is a value problem, and then the skeptical period, it's a form problem. And so Spengler sees it simply as a morphological problem. So this corresponds to the rise of Hellenistic skepticism, which comes after the period of socialism, Epicurus and Zeno and so forth. So then in the Great Civilization period, life becomes a problem to be lived, and Spengler says that this is when the megalopolis itself takes over, and science becomes the great basis for the civilization, and the soulless intellect begins to take over, and it sterilizes tradition. It sees anything traditional is seen as a weight, as a burden. In the arts, the grand style is a burden, and it has to be shed, starting with Beethoven and Wagner, and it's gradually gotten rid of until by the time of Mahler, it's gone for the most part. And in painting with Impressionism, breaking itself away from the shackles of the old Rembrandt Brown and the great metaphysical world picture of depth, perspectival space. The tradition is done away with, and we have schools and fashions, as we said last time, replacing the grand style in painting. And in philosophy also, the great tradition falls away, metaphysics falls away, and the world as nature picture becomes a flat one. So we have the replacement of the intensive, the spiritual inwardness of the culture phase is replaced by the extensive outwardness of the civilization phase. Everything is outer directed in the civilization phase, and the civilization develops slowly. It's imperialism, which trades off inward richness for the outer conquest of geographical gigantism and the building of the universal state and the empire, as a very poor, impoverished compensation for the building of the inner empire of the mind, the depth and richness of a grand spiritual metaphysical tradition. And these great philosophers, these Socratic men, I want to take a look just for a second at Nietzsche's characterization in Twilight of the Idols of Socrates, just to finish this off, when he says here that of Socrates, when one finds it necessary to turn reason into a tyrant, as Socrates did, the danger cannot be slight that something else will play the tyrant. Rationality was then hit upon as the savior. Neither Socrates nor his patients had any choice but being rational. It was de rigueur. It was their last resort. The fanaticism with which all Greek reflection throws itself upon rationality betrays a desperate situation. There was danger. There was but one choice, either to perish or to be absurdly rational. The moralism of the Greek philosophers from Plato on is pathologically conditioned. So is their esteem of dialectics. Reason, virtue, happiness. That means merely that one must imitate Socrates and counter the dark appetites with a permanent daylight, the daylight of reason. One must be clever, clear, bright at any price. Any concession to the instincts, to the unconscious, leads downward. And then he says in the next paragraph that Socrates was a misunderstanding. The whole improvement morality, including the Christian, was a misunderstanding. The most blinding daylight, rationality at any price, life, bright, cold, cautious, conscious, without instinct, in opposition to the instincts. All this too was a mere disease, another disease, and by no means a return to virtue, to health, to happiness. To have to fight the instincts, that is the formula of decadence. As long as life is ascending, happiness equals instinct. But when it's on the descending side, instinct becomes the thing that intellect turns against, and instinct becomes the enemy, as it is for the modern Marxist philosopher for the most part, whose worldview is a flat, shallow, cardboard one, a worldview of surfaces only, in which there are no metaphysical depths to anything. And I think we can see there that with Nietzsche's criticism of Socrates as the avatar of reason often gets missed by the postmodern intellectuals, I think, who regard Heidegger and Nietzsche as their gods, but they conveniently overlook that they selectively take from him that which is consistent with their own nihilism, and they leave behind his condemnation of the hypertrophic aspect of reason as the grand tool and worldview of the megalopolis, they leave that behind and conveniently overlook that really the whole point of Nietzsche's philosophy is that reason is a sterile manifestation of decadence. It's produced by something when it's dying. He describes intellect as the raven circling over, brought by the smell of the dead body. So that intellect becomes valued as the one and only true thing, in a purely shallow version of intellect, as the one and only true thing in the late megalopolitan phase that is of any kind of value at all. And the old traditions of religion and piety and soul and depth are done away with. Once that happens, though, and the whole point of Nietzsche, who's Spengler's precursor here, is that once that happens, though, the society is doomed. It's on its way out. You can't build a civilization for very long on something as shallow as mere reason. It won't. Everything has to be thought out. Every problem has to be solved. In the place of organic things growing organically, everything has to be intellectually coldly assembled in the sterile light of day. The cosmopolis takes over, dominates over the countryside. The city becomes the primary thing, and the cosmopolis dominates over the countryside, and the peasant is seen as something laughable. Whereas in the previous culture period, the peasant and his ties to the soil, even living in the town, had been the whole point of the thing, this connection with tradition and piety. So we can see that the conservatism here of Spengler and Nietzsche is really a holding on to this whole world of culture that Confucius was doing something similar to in China in the days of the 100 schools, and that it is something that has begun to disappear and dissolve from the surface of civilization until now we are left with what we're left with. A megalopolis filled with fact men who regard anything that has anything to do with spirituality as New Age. It's dismissed and thrown into the New Age dustbin, where it thrives, much to the impoverishment of the intellect. And so there's a real dismissal of anything spiritual as something that's leftover. It's a holdover from a former metaphysical age of civilization, and is something that needs to be done away with. What they don't know, though, what that point of view doesn't recognize, is that, as Spengler's whole cyclical theory of culture shows us, the days of intellect are numbered, the days of reason are numbered, as it was for the Romans, who, when the Roman Imperium came, constructed a second religiousness. All the cults came back in, astrology, Mithraism, Mandeanism, they all came back in, and the second religiousness kicked up, and once it kicked up, philosophy began to turn back toward the spirit world, and slowly the intellect then became exterminated until it's completely wiped out. By the time you get to Theodosius and his proscriptions at the end of the 4th century AD, it's gone. The intellect is basically gone. It has become the victim of piety and irrationalism, which now has completely swamped and overtaken it. The way it is the case, for example, today amongst New Agers. We can already see a premonition of this. And so for a healthy civilization, I think what Spengler and Nietzsche are saying is really that intellect and the respect for the non-rational, morphogenetic, self-organizing forces of the world need to be in balance. In order to have a healthy civilization, this Apollonian intellect and this Dionysian instincts, and seeing the instincts and trusting the instincts is full of wisdom, and having a world-building formative force to them, not something that's hostile to the intellect, but is trying to carry it along to help it construct a world. That is their ideal for the healthy aspect of a civilization. And I think Nietzsche's theory of the Superman too has something of this idea that since this is no longer possible in our civilization, since reason has taken the field, and it'll be another century or so before the irrational begins to take over the culture again, in a negative way with the second religiousness, where it will begin to swamp it. All we have then is Nietzsche's ideal of the Superman, is the one who in Zarathustra can attain the balance between this lyrical, creative spontaneity, which is dismissed by the rationalist as being irrational. It's not irrational, it's a trust in the super-rational form-building forces that come out of nature, that come out of the world, which are fundamentally have intelligence in them, as Hegel saw with his idea of the world spirit. That is not just hostile to the intellect, but something that the intellect needs to work with in order to construct a universe. So that then is the second to last chapter of Decline of the One, and so Decline of the West, Volume 1. And so in the next discussion, we'll finish this off with a discussion of chapter 11, Faustian and Apollonian nature knowledge.